During World War II, the United States built entire cities that did not exist, not in ruins, not abandoned. They simply were not there, not on maps, not in phone books, not in the memory of anyone who was allowed to speak of them. Tens of thousands of people lived in these cities. They had schools, they had churches, they had grocery stores and movie theaters and bowling alleys. Children were born there. Old men died there. And yet, if you had asked a mapmaker in 1944 to point to where these cities stood, he would have shrugged. As far as the world knew, there was nothing there but forest or desert or empty farmland. The people who lived inside these cities worked every day at enormous factories and laboratories. They wore badges. They walked past armed guards. They signed papers promising never to speak about what they saw. And here is the strangest part of all. Most of them did not know what they were building. They knew they were part of something huge. They could feel it in the size of the buildings, in the amount of money being spent, in the way the guards watched every gate. But the actual purpose, the final goal, the thing all of this effort was building toward, was kept from almost everyone, even from the people building it with their own hands. This is the story of those cities. It is a story of secrecy so total that husbands could not tell wives, and wives could not tell each other. And children who grew up inside barbed wire fences had no idea their own hometown was hiding one of the biggest secrets in human history. And by the end of this story, you will know exactly what that secret was. But you must earn it. Just like the tens of thousands of workers who lived and worked for years without knowing, you're going to walk through this story one piece at a time. Watch closely, because the answer is hiding in plain sight the entire way through. A city that did not exist. In the hills of eastern Tennessee, in the early autumn of 1942, government agents arrived quietly. They did not come with trumpets or announcements. They came with maps, surveying equipment, and checkbooks. They knocked on the doors of farmhouses that had stood for generations. Families who had grown corn and raised cattle on the same land for 100 years were told they had a matter of weeks to leave. Some were paid a fair price. Many were not. Gravestones were dug up and moved. Barns that had stood since before the Civil War were torn down within days. The families who lived there did not know why. They were simply told it was for the war effort and that asking questions was not welcome. Many wept as they packed their belongings onto wagons and trucks, looking back at homes they would never see again. Where their farms had stood, bulldozers arrived. Then came trucks loaded with lumber. Then came thousands and thousands of workers brought in from every corner of the country. Within months, a small city sprang up in the valley. Streets were laid out. Simple wooden houses were built in neat rows. A hospital appeared. Schools were built for the children who were already arriving with their families. The city would eventually be called Oak Ridge, but when it was being built, it appeared on no census, no state road map, no postal directory. Letters addressed to people living there had to be sent to a post office box in another town, because officially this place was nothing. A blank space of green forest, according to any map you could buy in a store. By 1945, more than 75,000 people were living in Oak Ridge. 75,000 people in a city that, according to official government records, barely existed. It had grown faster than almost any city in American history, and yet almost nobody outside its fences knew it was there. Inside the fences, the workers went about strange and repetitive jobs. Thousands of young women sat for hours in front of control panels covered in dials and switches. They were told to turn a dial until a needle reached a certain number, then hold it there. Over and over, hour after hour, shift after shift. They were never told what the machines actually did. They were never told what substance was moving through the pipes beside them. They were given a job, a badge, a paycheck, and a warning. Never speak of your work to anyone, not your husband, not your mother, not your best friend in the next bunk over. Many of these young women had grown up on farms, the same kind of farms that had once stood where Oak Ridge now sprawled. They had left home for the first time in their lives to take a factory job that promised good pay and a chance to help the war effort. Instead, they found themselves living behind fences, watched by guards, forbidden from asking the simplest question, what am I actually making? Some of them guessed it might be part of an airplane. Some thought it might be a new kind of rubber, since rubber was in short supply during the war. A few even joked that they were probably building something for President Roosevelt's slippers, since the buildings were so heavily guarded for something so mysterious. None of them were even close. And they would not learn the truth for years. A desert with no name. At the same time, far to the southwest, in the high deserts of New Mexico, another secret city was rising. This one was even stranger because it was built for a very different kind of worker. Instead of factory workers, this desert town gathered scientists. Brilliant men and women, some of the greatest scientific minds in the world, were quietly approached in their university offices and told that their country needed them for a project so important they could not be told what it was until they agreed to go. Many of them said yes without knowing where they were going or what they would be doing. They simply trusted that if their government was asking with this much secrecy, the cause must be enormous. They arrived by train, then by bus, climbing a winding dirt road up a high plateau surrounded by canyons and pine forests. At the top, they found a small boarding school that had been shut down and taken over by the government. Around it, workers were hurriedly building barracks, laboratories, and small wooden homes. This place would come to be called Los Alamos, but like Oak Ridge, it had no name on any public map. Letters to scientists living there were addressed only to a single post office box in Santa Fe, a city over an hour away. If a scientist's mother wrote asking for a home address, she was told there wasn't one to give. The scientists who moved there were told to leave their old lives behind almost entirely. They were given new, plain last names to use in daily conversation, so that if anyone overheard them talking, they could not be identified. Some of the most famous physicists in the world were suddenly going by simple code names, blending into a community that officially was not there. Wives who joined their husbands were often told nothing about the actual work. They knew their husbands vanished behind guarded fences every morning and returned every evening looking exhausted, sometimes excited, sometimes worried, but always silent about the details. Children ran and played in the dusty streets of this hidden town, not understanding why their fathers could never talk about their jobs at the dinner table. To them, it was simply home. A home with mountain views, howling coyotes at night, and a strange, unspoken rule that some questions were never to be asked out loud. The scientists worked long hours in laboratories built almost overnight. They filled chalkboards with equations that only a handful of people in the entire world could understand. They argued fiercely, late into the night, about numbers and theories that seemed to be building towards something enormous, something almost impossible to imagine. But even many of the scientists working on smaller pieces of the puzzle did not know how their piece fit into the whole. The project had been broken apart on purpose, like a jigsaw puzzle scattered into different rooms, so that no single person in any single city held the entire picture. The River of Silence. Meanwhile, in the far northwest corner of the country, along the banks of the Columbia River in the state of Washington, a third secret city was taking shape. This one may have been the strangest of all. Government agents arrived in this rural farming region, and, much like in Tennessee, ordered families to leave their homes within weeks. Orchards that had taken decades to grow were bulldozed. Small towns that had stood for generations were emptied out entirely, their names slowly forgotten. In their place rose enormous industrial buildings unlike anything ever built before. Towering concrete structures rose from the desert scrubland, connected by miles of pipes and rail lines. Thousands of construction workers poured in, living in a rapidly built camp of trailers and barracks that swelled to become one of the largest communities in the entire state, almost overnight. At the peak of construction, more people were living in this hidden site than in many established American cities. And yet, once again, it appeared on no public map. Its name, Hanford, was known only to those who worked there and the government officials who had ordered it built. The workers at Hanford were given jobs even stranger than those in Tennessee. They operated enormous machines along the riverbank, guiding water and unknown materials through massive concrete buildings that towers hundreds of feet into the sky. They wore protective clothing that seemed excessive for jobs they were told involved nothing dangerous. They noticed strange things. Warning signs about radiation, a word most of them had never even heard before the war. Doctors on site who gave them regular checkups, taking blood samples and asking odd questions about how they felt. Some workers noticed with unease that certain areas of the site were far more heavily guarded than others, as if something incredibly important or incredibly dangerous was happening just beyond a fence they were never allowed to cross. Still, when asked what they did for a living, most workers had no real answer to give. They knew only their small piece of an enormous humming machine. They knew the buttons to press, the levers to pull, the readings to record. What all of it added up to remained a total mystery. 3 cities: Tennessee, New Mexico, Washington. Built in secret, populated by tens of thousands of people, connected by an invisible thread that none of the workers could see. Farmers, young factory workers, brilliant scientists, engineers, doctors, teachers, and children, all living inside a secret so enormous it required building entire towns from nothing just to contain it. And still, the biggest question remained completely hidden. What in the world were they building? Lives lived in the dark. Imagine living for years beside your neighbor, sharing coffee on the porch, watching each other's children grow, without ever once being able to ask the most obvious question of all. What do you do at work? This was daily life inside these secret cities. Husbands who worked different shifts than their wives sometimes went days barely speaking about anything beyond household matters. Because the moment conversation turned toward work, a wall of silence dropped down immediately. Some workers grew so used to the secrecy that they stopped being curious altogether. It became normal to walk past guarded buildings without wondering what was inside. It became normal for a young woman to spend 8 hours a day watching a needle on a dial without asking what the needle measured. It became normal for a scientist to solve one small piece of a puzzle and hand it off to someone else, never seeing how the pieces fit together. But for many, the silence was heavy. Diaries written during this time reveal a quiet, constant unease. Workers wrote of strange dreams, of headaches from long hours staring at dials, of whispered rumors passed between friends late at night, rumors that were almost always wrong, but revealed just how desperately people wanted to understand what they were part of. Religious services in these towns were unusually well attended. Many workers, unable to speak about the fears building quietly inside them, turned to prayer instead. Ministers in these secret towns later remembered congregations, praying for the war to end soon, praying for their loved ones fighting overseas, and quietly praying that whatever they themselves were building back home was good and right and worth all of this sacrifice. Children living in these towns grew up with a strange kind of normal. They played baseball in dusty streets surrounded by barbed wire fences. They went to schools where teachers, too, had no idea what their students' parents did behind guarded gates each day. Some children later remembered believing quite innocently that everyone in America lived behind fences and showed identification badges just to buy groceries. It was simply the only version of life they had ever known. Letters sent home to relatives outside these cities were read and censored before they were mailed. Any mention of specific jobs, specific buildings, or specific materials was cut out with scissors before the letter ever left town. Grandparents who received these letters sometimes found holes cut clean through the paper as if someone had taken tiny scissors to their grandchild's most personal thoughts. And yet, through all of this secrecy, an enormous sense of purpose held these communities together. Workers spoke often of believing, deep down, that they were helping to end the war faster. Posters around these secret towns reminded everyone constantly, "What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, stays here when you leave here." It became almost a kind of prayer of its own, repeated so often that workers whispered it to each other as a joke, and also, quietly, as a promise they intended to keep for the rest of their lives. Many of them did keep that promise. Decades later, elderly men and women who had worked in these secret cities as young adults still hesitated before answering questions about their old jobs, the habit of silence so deeply carved into them that it never fully faded, even long after the secret had become known to the entire world. The question no one could ask. By 1945, something was clearly building toward a climax. Workers in all three secret cities noticed the tension rising. More guards appeared, more scientists arrived at Los Alamos, working even longer hours than before. Trains loaded with mysterious, heavily guarded cargo left Oak Ridge and Hanford in the dead of night, headed toward the New Mexico desert. Rumors swirled with more intensity than ever. Some workers whispered that the war might be ending very soon. Others whispered, with a strange mixture of hope and dread, that whatever they had been building for years was finally actually about to be used. In the deserts of New Mexico, in the earliest hours before dawn on a July morning in 1945, a small group of scientists and military officers gathered at a remote testing site far from any of the secret cities. They had spent years building toward this single moment. Some of them had barely slept in days. Some wore dark sunglasses despite the pre-dawn darkness, worn to protect their eyes from what was about to happen. They waited in trenches and bunkers, watching a strange metal tower rising alone in the empty desert. Radios crackled with tense countdowns. Some scientists reportedly placed bets on whether the test would succeed at all, or whether it might fail completely, or whether, in the most extreme and terrifying guesses, it might ignite the entire atmosphere and end life on Earth as they knew it. Nobody knew for certain which outcome awaited them. And then, in a single blinding instant, the desert sky lit up brighter than the sun itself. A wall of heat rolled across the sand. A shockwave rattled windows in towns dozens of miles away, in towns where confused residents woke up wondering if a nearby ammunition dump had exploded, since surely nothing on Earth could cause such an enormous flash and roar. A massive cloud, shaped unlike anything anyone in that desert had ever seen, rose into the brightening morning sky. The scientists who had spent years building toward this single moment stood in stunned silence. Some wept, some cheered, some simply stared, unable to speak, understanding in that instant that the entire world had changed forever, and that they themselves had changed it. Still, back in Oak Ridge, back in Hanford, thousands of workers who had spent years turning dials and guiding pipes and recording numbers had absolutely no idea that any of this had happened. Life in the secret cities continued exactly as normal that morning. Breakfast was served, shifts began, dials were watched. Nobody there yet knew that the mysterious material they had helped create, piece by piece, dial by dial, pipe by pipe, had just been tested successfully in a desert hundreds of miles away. The final piece of the secret was still just weeks away from being revealed to the entire world, and to the very workers who had built it with their own hands, without ever truly understanding what they were building. The secret revealed. On August 6, 1945, an American airplane flew high above the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Inside its cargo bay was a single bomb unlike any weapon ever used in human history before that morning. When it detonated, it released more destructive power in a single instant than any weapon in the history of warfare. An entire city was devastated in seconds. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on the city of Nagasaki. with similarly devastating results. Within days, Japan surrendered. The Second World War, a war that had raged for 6 long years and claimed the lives of millions of people across the entire globe, finally came to an end. And it was only then, only after those 2 bombs fell, that the workers back home finally understood. The dials the young women had watched so carefully in Tennessee, hour after hour, day after day, had been separating a rare and powerful material needed to build these very bombs. The pipes the workers guided so carefully along the riverbanks in Washington had been producing a different, equally powerful material for the exact same purpose. The equations the scientists in New Mexico had scrawled across their chalkboards late into the night, the desert test that lit up the sky brighter than the sun itself, all of it had been building piece by piece toward the creation of the atomic bomb. The secret cities had not been built to hide factories or laboratories or scientists or workers. They had been built to hide the most powerful weapon the world had ever known, spread across 3 secret locations so that no single city, no single worker, no single scientist ever held enough of the picture to give the secret away. Newspapers across the country exploded with the news. Families who had lived for years beside secret factories finally understood what their loved ones had been building all along. Workers who had spent years believing they might be making rubber or airplane parts or something entirely mundane suddenly discovered they had helped build the single most powerful weapon in human history. Reactions inside the secret cities were a complicated mixture of pride, relief, shock, and grief. Many workers felt an overwhelming sense of relief that the terrible war was finally over, and that their own sons, brothers, and husbands, fighting overseas, would finally be coming home. Others felt a deep and lasting sorrow, understanding the terrible human cost of the weapon they had helped create. The scientists at Los Alamos, many of whom had celebrated wildly on the morning of that first desert test, found their celebrations replaced by heavier, more complicated feelings once they learned exactly how their creation had been used. Some of them would spend the rest of their lives wrestling with the weight of what they had built. The secret cities did not disappear after the war ended. Oak Ridge and Los Alamos and Hanford remained important centers of scientific research for decades afterward, eventually appearing on maps, gaining official names, becoming real towns with real histories that the public could finally learn about and visit. But for those first few critical years, they were among the best-kept secrets in the history of the entire world. Entire cities, filled with tens of thousands of ordinary people, quietly building the single most extraordinary and terrifying weapon in human history, without most of them ever understanding, until the very final moment, exactly what they had helped create. That was the promise made at the very beginning of this story. Secret cities were built during World War II, cities that did not exist on any map, filled with people who did not know what they were building. Now you know their names: Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, Hanford. And now you know their secret. The atomic bomb, the weapon that ended the deadliest war in human history, was built piece by piece, dial by dial, inside cities that, according to the rest of the world, simply were not there.